All right, thanks everyone. That was an incredible first three talks. Really set the stage for us here. I'd like to briefly introduce my fellow panelists, and then I'm going to set the stage for the context of where we're at with soils and soil carbon removal within the Roads to Removal report and within Wyoming. And then we have some great expertise here, local expertise. We're going to dive in this panel from the surface, the top meter, thinking about carbon storage in the very top meter of our land surface. And then we're going to dive all the way down to the pore space as well, thinking about land ownership. So I'm really looking forward to this. So first I'll introduce myself. I'll introduce myself. I'm Allegra Mayer. I'm one of the authors of the Roads to Removal report. I led the soils and cropland chapter. To my right here is Jennifer Bell with the University of Wyoming, an ecologist. After that, we'll meet Nora Cohen-Brown, who's with Charm Industries. And after that, Jim Magagna, who's with the Wyoming you're with the Stock Growers Association. And then Jason Crowder, all the way at the end, with the Wyoming Office of State Lands and Investments. So we've got some great and diverse expertise here. I'm going to start just by emphasizing what Dr. Jennifer Pettridge has just said. We have 4 different pathways that we analyzed in the Roads to Removal report. And I'm going to focus today on the soils piece. What I want us to know is that there's pretty much no downside to investing in carbon removals in soils. It's a very holistic opportunity. Generally, there's a reason that we do these types of activities is to reduce erosion in soils, to increase habitat for our pollinators, pretty much all environmental benefits. And soils can contribute in the near term. In fact, a lot of the ways that croplands are being managed, starting now, we can increase carbon, not just in croplands, but also in our rangelands. And some of you are already on that in terms of your management. Of course, soils can't be the only technique we're using. And that's because there's just, with the rate of management, we're just going to need so much more carbon removal. So I'm going to talk about this as one piece, a very important piece, especially in the near term piece of the puzzle when it comes to carbon dioxide removal. So how are we going to go about, let's talk about the mechanisms of increasing carbon soil. Often in croplands in the United States, we're talking about annual rotations. That comes with growing corn or growing here in Wyoming, probably wheat or hay, in rotation with some other crops. At some point in that rotation, you're going to have a fallow period where nothing's growing. If we can increase the amount of time where any type of vegetation is growing, whether it's planting a cover crop, here we see, planting a cover crop, which would be a cereal rye in between those periods. So when you're growing something, you're not harvesting it, but you're actually still using that OG carbon direct air capture and removing CO2 from the atmosphere via photosynthesis, storing it in roots below ground. The other alternatives are planting perennial crops, even a carbon crop like switchgrass, or that can grow year-round and their roots grow deep into the soil where you're then increasing that carbon down much deeper, whereas it will stay for longer. And alternatively, we can talk about planting perennial field borders around the edges of crop fields or even around rangelands. And we have an expert on the panel who is going to talk about perennial field borders or prairie strips, which are also beneficial for all these other reasons, including habitat for birds if you're a hunter, or for pollinators. So these existing practices, they already are in use in a lot of places, but we're probably going to need some type of financial incentive to improve the adoption rate. So we're going to talk here about some of those potential financial incentives. We understand that farmers and landowners aren't going to implement anything if they're going to lose money on it. It's only going to happen if you can make some money. So we understood that in this report, and we analyzed where that is likely to happen, depending on how much you might pay for carbon. I want to point out that within our report, we analyzed annual croplands, which means that we excluded in the report talking about rangeland management and other types of practices like enhanced rock weathering, which is kind of up and coming technology. But especially here in Wyoming, there's big opportunities for improving soil carbon through rangeland management. And so that's why you might not see the map that it's popping in the report if you look in your executive summaries. But we'll talk to some experts here that are going to tell us exactly how you might improve carbon through grazing management. And you do have opportunities here in Wyoming for that. So I want to talk, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty here. I want you to come home with the idea that improving soil carbon is going to be generally, holistically, a benefit to everyone, to water quality, to air quality, and to biodiversity. Some of the big opportunities here are through prairie strips, land set-asides, and grazing management. Or Jason's going to talk about some land set-aside with the CRP program. Generally, soil carbon removal is inexpensive, and it's available right now in the near term. And there are lots of co-benefits. And so with that, I'm going to get to our first questions. We're going to start with Jennifer. So Jennifer's a professor at University of Wyoming right here. So would you mind please introducing yourself and talking to us a little bit about your research on prairie strips and perennial field borders and the mechanisms of carbon removal?
Sure, thank you, Allegra. So as Allegra said, I am a professor here of soil science. I'm in ecosystem management and the School of Energy Resources, and I specialize in soil microbial ecology. So what are all those microbes doing in the soil? I also work on prairie restoration, and in Wyoming, I'm going to be focusing on prairie reclamation after mining or energy resource of extraction of any kind. So prairie strips are a really low maintenance way for farmers to incorporate some sort of carbon storage. So those native plants have much deeper roots than many of our crops, so they're literally funneling carbon down into the soil. They also have other benefits which can reduce emissions. So they, like was mentioned previously, they stop erosion. In Wyoming, that's primarily through wind, as we all are aware of, but also water. So it increases your water holding capacity by literally keeping it in your system, which is going to benefit your crops. And it's also going to hold on to the nutrients in that system. So we all know that agriculture causes a lot of runoff through nitrogen and phosphorus loss. So incorporating native plants into your farming practices is going to keep that in your system as well. And again, it's really low management. So after the first year or two after establishment, even in Wyoming where we're super water limited, you don't really have to do much. You just kind of let it go. So it's a really low cost and low maintenance way to improve your soil quality around your fields. So.
Thank you, Jennifer. We'll move on to Nora Cohen-Brown. If you would mind, please introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about what you all do at Charm Industrial, especially about your projects, I know, in this region.
Thank you so much. Oh, can you hear me? Okay. Sorry, I couldn't hear it. So as you said, I'm Nora Cohen-Brown. It's great to be here and excited to tell you a little bit about what we do at Charm. And I run policy and market development at Charm, so don't ask me too many super technical questions, but I can speak a lot to kind of the overall benefits of what we do. So Charm is a carbon removal company, and we really focus on using underutilized resources to do carbon removal, and in a small modular way, so not very small impact. So what we do is we use biomass residues as an input. So the way that I fit in with land management is that we don't really impact land management practices. We can store more carbon if land is managed in a way to store that carbon in soil. But we basically take residues like either corn stover or other agricultural residues that generally are a waste. We pay farmers for them, so we provide an extra income stream. Or we also do projects with forestry where we take the residues of wildfire thinning projects, similar to what was talked about earlier. We have several projects that we're working on in the Front Range in Colorado, for instance, where we are able to basically take small diameter wood that doesn't have a timber market and generally is basically a residue that doesn't have a home, and we can put it through our process, which is a pyrolysis process. So basically what we do is we take those residues, we heat them up with very little oxygen in a small modular machine, and it converts them into a very carbon-rich bio-oil. That oil has a high water content, so it's not very suitable for fuel, but it stores a lot of carbon within it. And so what we actually do is reuse orphan and idle wells to store that carbon. So we're able to take existing resources and in a similar way, pay landowners to lease their wells. In a lot of cases, this is really beneficial because it's maybe something that used to be an oil and gas producer that no longer has economic value for that landowner. So we're able to create new value by leasing that those assets. And bio oil itself, it's like a really sticky, viscous substance. It smells like barbecue sauce. Do not eat it, but it's the same elements as what's in liquid smoke in barbecue sauce. But the way that it flows, it's like so sticky that we don't use pipelines. We use tankers to transport it. And when we inject it underground, it hardens. So it stays in place very permanently, but it's also really easy to manage in that it doesn't, it only goes like a few hundred feet once we put it in a well. So that's why we're able to reuse existing resources to do that. So I kind of talked about both the surface and the, the subsurface, but we have a large field office in Colorado. We've created about 65 jobs there within the past year. And given the proximity, we're really interested in potentially doing similar operations in Wyoming and really starting to explore that opportunity, which is part of why I'm here today.
Thanks, Nora. Yeah, and maybe at some point you can mention a piece about the biochar that you also
Yes,
are.
we also produce biochar, which can be used as a soil amendment and help to improve, rangelands and farmlands as well.
Thanks. And now I'd like to welcome Jim Magagna. Thank you so much for joining us, a long-term rancher. Would you mind introducing yourself and then telling us a bit about some of the practices that you use on your land for improving soil carbon?
Sure, very much, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. I think it's important, first of all, to kind of set the stage for what we're looking at when we bring the carbon discussion to agriculture in Wyoming. Over 80% of agriculture in our state is livestock grazing, primarily on native rangelands. So of all the things that you mentioned very much, on a per acre basis, how we manage native rangelands is the least contributor to carbon storage, but because of the massive acreage we have here, I think that's the key tool in terms of surface use of landscapes for maintaining carbon storage in the state of Wyoming. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. I have a ranch over in western Wyoming. It's primarily federal lands that I graze on, so I don't have a lot of opportunity to undertake practices just on my own, but I'm familiar with the practices around the state in my role as Executive Vice President of the Wyoming Stockgrowers Association, and there certainly is some increasing interest across the state in managing rangelands to foster carbon sequestration. I would be very honest with you, it's not driven by saving the climate, it's driven by an added source of revenue for ranching operations that often struggle for that revenue.
Right, and we totally understand that everything has to do, you have to meet the bottom line at the very least in order to get anything, any type of practice to change. Thanks, Jim. Okay, Jason, with the Office of State Lands and Management, would you please introduce yourself and could you tell us something about the low-hanging opportunities that you see for enhancing soil carbon in the state of Wyoming, including, I think, both grazing management and the CRP program?
Yeah, thanks, Allegra. Jason Crowder, I'm the interim director. There we go. I'll just get it closer, sorry. Interim director for the Office of State Lands and Investments. We manage 3.4 million acres across the state, the second largest landowner in the state of Wyoming, second to the federal government. And with that, we get to be involved in every single land management or land opportunity that's present in the state of Wyoming. Carbon management, taking advantage of that opportunity is certainly one of those. As Allegra mentioned, a lot of reasons to do that is monetary, just like Mr. Magagna also mentioned. And that's what we are mostly passionate about. We're obviously a revenue generating agency, but we want that land to be sustainable for that revenue generation for the long term. And doing something with the carbon is a secondary benefit to that revenue stream that we've been accustomed to generating from the grazing uses across Wyoming. as Mr. Magagna mentioned, it is important to note that, carbon management isn't the top of mind for any of us that manage land across the state of Wyoming, but it's a byproduct. When you do proper rangeland management, you're creating a sustainable environment for revenue generation, for industries in the state of Wyoming to continue on. And when you do it in just a little bit different way, or you do it with a little bit more focus to the biomass that's actually on the ground that's creating that revenue potential, you are storing carbon. You're doing that without even realizing it. Some of the best ranchers that I know didn't grow up to be carbon managers. They didn't even grow up to be grass managers. They grew up to be cow managers. And as they evolve, they say, well, now I'm not just growing cows, I'm growing grass. And that's what I'm going to focus on. And now the next evolution for them is now I'm managing for carbon. And when they do that, they realize there's a revenue stream. And as Mr. Magagna mentioned, there's a lot of revenue that can be garnered from land management that's not from cows. And when you have a problem with market conditions, with being very subject to how those markets ebb and flow in how much revenue you can put back into your operations or even sustain a family on a ranching operation, you look at those ancillary benefits. You look at access for hunting, you look at access for ranch recreation, and now we're looking at carbon. Not only for grazing management and the health of the rangelands, which increase the health of the soil that stores the carbon, but you have that pore space. And as was mentioned earlier, the surface owner manages the pore space or has rights to that pore space. And as from the State Land Office, we've gotten into 2 deep carbon storage projects across the state, about 30,000 acres under lease, that provides another revenue stream, not only for my purposes, but for those adjacent landowners that are with us in a project. They are benefiting from the pore space and storing that carbon deep underground, and probably won't ever see a surface impact from that. They just see the revenue stream as it comes back to them. So that's all a positive thing. And you mentioned CRP, and I'm sorry I glossed over that, but I'll come back to it. But through the Farm Bill, the federal government has given opportunities for conservation, setting aside highly erodible lands from agriculture production and setting them aside to I guess, make that soil healthier, to not run off into the Missouri River, things like that. But one of those components is to provide grazing management practices or provide help to grazers for management practices and compensate them for that. So they tweak their grazing just a little bit, and with that comes compensation back to that landowner. And it's a good program. We take advantage of it. Our lessees take advantage of it. They do it more on the landscape level. It's not just, state leases that get that benefit, but they do it on their private land too. And when you have a conservation measure that is landscape in size or landscape in scope, it's much more positive, it's much more productive, it's much more beneficial, and we play a role in that. And I think that when you have that type of carrot, I guess, financial carrot, folks, especially in Wyoming, go more in that direction. And then we have everything that grows from that, and like I said, the evolution all the way up to carbon management.
That's a great overview. Thank you so much. I'd like, maybe we'll start and then come back this direction. A question to all of you. What are some of you've already mentioned some of the incentives that are available for landowners to store carbon in their land, but what are kind of let's start on the surface for now. What are some of the challenges or opportunities that you see as why would a landowner choose to implement a practice or not, and what might be a barrier to implementation or to accessing that incentive? And we'll pose that to the whole panel.
And I'll be brief since I took a long time with that last answer, but I think the biggest barrier is change. Understanding that carbon is something that has a focus on it, maybe not here in Wyoming, but it's having a larger focus on it. So getting your landowners on the surface to change their grazing practices with that focus in mind. And that's not going to happen overnight. And certainly you have to have a financial carrot to bring them to that part of the table. The benefit, obviously, is that financial carrot that has a broader impact to the nation and maybe the world from this island in Wyoming, always being at the tip of the spear, I guess.
I think there's two things that are particularly important here. First of all, when you talk about financial incentive for carbon storage through resource management, through grassland management, and you enhance the root system on these plants and that. One of the things we run into constantly as we talk with our membership across the state and encourage them to look at these opportunities is that the landowner, the rancher who's managed their land well for the last 3 or 4 decades, has taken good care of it and has maximized that under the programs we see today, has little to no opportunity for financial gain. The one who's not properly managed, or the predecessors haven't for a couple of generations, then they have the greatest opportunity to be rewarded for what they do now, when in a sense they should be punished for what they failed to do in the past. So that's one big challenge for us. The other one is, if you look at the state of Wyoming, and the eastern part of the state is largely private land, and those private landowners can come together as the group that was mentioned earlier that's doing in southeastern Wyoming, and they can find something that they're all comfortable with. As you move across the state to the west and you get the areas that are so heavily federally managed lands, there's a real reluctance by landowners to enter into any of these type of arrangements because it makes them partners with federal agencies that control the vast majority of the land, and the private landowners are fearful of losing control. If the federal government starts to enter into practices to enhance carbon storage, are they then going to mandate what I have to do? I don't control what I do. So those are two of I think the major objectives on a broad scale to implementing surface carbon storage activities in the state. The third one is just gaining a comfort level, and I see that as expanding over time. Even as recent as half a dozen years ago. One, it wasn't well understood. Secondly, people were frightened by it. We still have the people today, certainly in our industry, who thinks it's the devil coming after them. But those who are beginning to understand it as an opportunity, I think that component is increasing on an ongoing basis.
I'm going to answer this actually from the opportunity end, because Charm, we have such a different approach to this, in that we're actually not really impacting. We trust that landowners understand how to manage their lands, and also there are a lot of opportunities now to monetize some of that management, even if there are some challenges. This is sort of a separate opportunity for monetization that doesn't actually impact that, right? And that we're taking residues. And to be clear, when we talk about agricultural residues, there's always a certain percentage that needs to stay on the field or on the land in order to ensure, healthy soil and all of that. So we're always looking at working with a land manager on kind of how much to take, but we're providing an economic opportunity that's, we're just paying per unit. So it's the same as, purchasing a bale of straw, right? We're looking to purchase that, those products outright. And so I think that there's an interesting opportunity there for landowners to actually pair that with some of these other like soil carbon practices.
Okay, I feel like I'm going to give you the typical academic answer, being, the academic on the panel, so I apologize. So I'm really big into ecosystem services, and so this is what we get from ecosystems that aren't necessarily monetized, but they're monetized if we lose them. So the CRP program is really great because you change your grazing practices, and while that may affect your bottom line, it is increasing what we get from the land outside of it. So if we allow our rangelands to become more diverse, less overgrazed, they're actually going to be a lot more resilient in the long run. So not only are we going to store more carbon, but by increasing our plant diversity through proper grazing practices, it's going to be a lot more resilient to drought and storms and just disturbance in general, which is going to increase in the coming decades. So by properly managing our rangelands, we may not get, an immediate financial benefit that's large, but in the long term, it really will pay off. And the healthier our rangelands are, the healthier our cattle is going to be, which will eventually impact your bottom line, right? So again, the slow academic here, I'm thinking on the scale of, 20, 30 years down the line rather than immediate, so.
Well, that was really great to get the perspectives, not only about the additionality piece about what I've been doing this for decades, but then also, okay, but also the decades long matters a lot for the bottom line. So maybe it comes out in the wash in terms of where you're, of course, it doesn't feel good in the moment. But since we have some politicians in the room right now, I thought it might be a good opportunity to ask you all, do you see a role for any type of policy levers for changing the way that, or like maybe slightly improving the way that rangelands or croplands are managed in this region? And if so, or like if not, why not? Or what are the levers that you might see being useful here in this region? Jason?
Well, that's probably the most uncomfortable question ever with the politicians in the room. I think, you know, there is one fantastic benefit in the state of Wyoming is that our politicians are very much tied to the ground. It's a citizen legislature. The majority of them have some tie to agriculture, which means they have some tie to rangelands and to the soil, so they really understand it. And everything that they've done in creating the statutes and the rules and the policies that we live under have grown out of that. And so I don't know that there's anything new at the moment. There could be some incentives that we could talk about further a little more in detail that I'm not prepared to really display here, but or ever. But I think it's one of those really good positive things about the state of Wyoming is this is how it's been developed since statehood with that understanding.
I think perhaps some bit of non-direct financial incentive that can help in this. And now I tend to go back toward certainly where all the federal lands are, is if doing some of these practices, if we had a system that gave you more security in your right to graze those lands over a longer period of time, or even the same with the state trust lands, so that you're getting a sense of security. If I undertake these good practices, instead of having to defend my grazing permit every 10 years, I know that permit will pretty much automatically continue, that I don't face those threats, or maybe it has an extended term on it. We've looked at some of those possibilities. Most of the ones would be significant. Wyoming would require some action at the federal level, and legislation has been introduced to do some of that. To date, it hasn't moved anywhere, and we'll see whether it's able to in the future.
I'll just answer more generally that I think that the leadership that Wyoming's shown around looking at these new types of technologies and new ways to increase the, improve and grow the economy of the state is really impressive. And I think from our perspective, we just want to continue to make sure that those incentives are broad and apply to kind of all the different types of technologies and like different ways. We've seen things like looking at incentives to help with encouraging, wildfire thinning or other things that are, sort of tangential to carbon management, but also have really big co-benefits for the state and, sort of solve short-term problems. Those are the kinds of incentives that we're excited to see.
I'm actually with Jason on this one. I think we do a pretty good job in the state of protecting our lands. So as Jason said, it's pretty impossible not to be connected to the land in the state because there's 10 people and 10 million acres of land. But yeah, I mean, I agree that we could use more incentives for rangeland management, but coming from the reclamation side of this, the Wyoming DEQ does a great job regulating prairie reclamation and rangeland reclamation, as well as for hunting and recreation as well. Also, something that's unique to Wyoming is we have a great extension program, and it's funded pretty well. And it's free, so you can literally call your extension agent and come get help to manage your rangeland. And I think that's Wyoming does a really good job with that. So politicians keep funding that.
Well, thank you. I'm going to ask this panel one last group question, and then we're going to be diving down deep. But after that, I'm going to be opening up the floor to all of your questions. So go ahead and start thinking about what you might want to ask. So this we've seen already from Dr. Pettridge's talk that a lot of the big opportunity here in Wyoming for carbon removal is going to be through geologic storage. And that can be very meaningful for landowners who might have economic benefit from owning that surface, especially here in Wyoming. I'm wondering if we're going to go through again, and whoever is interested to start, go ahead and just get going. But I wonder if you could each comment on your perspective on either the ecological or the economic opportunities or maybe risks for landowners who might be considering allowing deep geologic pore space CO2 storage in their land.
Well, I might start out looking back in time the last 10 years. One of the things that we worked very hard on and feel very good about is the determination putting into law in Wyoming that the surface owner owns the pore space. And I think that does a lot to set the stage for the beginning point here. The thing I most often hear from landowners, they're very interested in playing this game. There's still some sense of uneasiness and perhaps based on just a lack of full understanding because it's relatively new. After the first 10 years when the entity that injects the carbon has responsibility, after that responsibility technically transfers to the state, but the landowners, many of them are concerned about longer term, next generation, what can happen, what's my responsibility going to be if that does happen. The other one, and this is back to the same thing I used on the surface because of the heavy presence of federal land ownership in the state, and because pore space doesn't recognize land ownership bounties, is if a group of landowners can come together and say, we're willing to work together for storage in this basin, as the group that was mentioned earlier that's being represented by my attorney friend back here, that works well. If you get into Sweetwater County, showed up as the place with the greatest potential for carbon sequestration. The problem you have there is because it's over 50% federal land, fear by landowners that the decisions of the Federal Land Agency will drive what happens in terms of carbon that becomes sequestered in the pore space under their private lands.
I'm happy to speak to it from CHARM's perspective. We have a little bit, as I talked about a little bit, our footprint is a little different when it comes to storage. We actually store in Class 5 UIC permitted wells rather than Class 6 because of the properties of bio-oil. Because it's this thick, viscous substance, it just doesn't have the same properties as what Class 6 accounts for. And also because we're looking to reuse existing assets, it means that we basically convert Class 2 or other oil and gas injectors to into Class 5 wells, so we can reuse them and then eventually cap them as well. So what we found is that we have a lot of interest from landowners. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, because a lot of times, they were making a profit from the oil and gas industry, and then, we're targeting wells where there is no longer oil and gas there. So in a lot of cases, it's really advantageous to them to get additional kind of unexpected income from those assets. But the other thing is that, a lot of our team has come from the oil and gas industry because we're basically doing the same process in reverse or something very similar to saltwater injection. So what we've seen, especially in energy communities where energy production has decreased, is that there's been a lot of interest and excitement about the economic opportunity that we can bring because we can employ even just like oil and gas service companies that have less work than they used to and things like that. So that has been a really exciting part of starting to grow our business, and we're excited to explore that opportunity here in Wyoming.
Yeah, ecologically speaking, I think it's a pretty low-risk activity for landowners to do, and it can also provide some income, which they might be worried about, when we ask them to graze less intensively on their land and to manage their rangeland health better. It really provides a nice buffer for them income-wise, and can allow them to focus more on improving their rangeland health, which in turn will store carbon in the top part of the soil as well as in the pore space. So.
well, Jennifer hit on something that I was going to say too, is we're not necessarily talking about a toxic substance here. And I think there's a lot of misconception and people who aren't fully aware of what we're talking about, because historically in Wyoming, when we put stuff in the ground, it's not good stuff, because otherwise we'd be using it. And when it comes back up, it's not a good situation. So we're not really talking about a toxic substance, and making sure landowners are aware of that. And we also need to educate them on where we're storing it. It's very deep in the ground, 3 to 5 miles underground, which is under all of the water-bearing zones that we would use for potable water, right? It's also supposed to be under the lowest oil-producing zone. So we're supposed to be protecting that right, the mineral rights down there, and not impacting that asset if you have that asset. One of the things that I'm hearing more and more, just as a risk for landowners to pay attention to, is that it is a surface right that can be severed. As Mr. McGagnon mentioned, we were very clear that it's going to be a surface right, but it is an asset of the owner. So you can sever that from any other right, and possibly folks are doing that and losing that ability to not only take advantage of the opportunity, but the control of what's being done with that pore space. So paying attention to that and understanding what rights you're giving away if there's a severing situation. The other thing is that the state of Wyoming hasn't just woken up yesterday and said, we're going to do this. There's been a lot of work that's gone into it. Lily is in the back. She's with DEQ, and she's going to be talking later. In my opinion, she is the czar of carbon storage in the state of Wyoming, and nationally, honestly. Anybody who has any questions should ask Lily. But she's been reviewing this, analyzing this, talking about this, and understands it better than anybody else I think there is. And so there should be some comfort level in the state of Wyoming for landowners to know that when the state of Wyoming steps in and approves a Class 6 well, there's a lot of thought that's gone into it, a lot of safeguards that have gone into it. Once the activity is done, once the wells are capped and that transition of responsibility leaves the landowner and the operator and it goes to the state of Wyoming, Lily's thought about that. She's put in safeguards to make sure that there is monitoring that occurs in a very long term, 100 years. There's monitoring that makes sure that there is no seepage back to the surface, and if that happens, if it should ever happen, I'm not sure how it could, that there are safeguards put in place there. So I think there's got to be a lot of comfort around this topic, and the only way you get to that comfort level is education. So there's carrots, there's opportunities, there's revenue to get you there, but also there's been a ton of work to make sure this is a safe practice.
One additional item that I mentioned that Jason just brought to my mind, particularly with legislators who may be listening or that, and I've thought about this many times. We all know the challenges that have been created by having mineral rights severable from the surface, and they get divided up over generations so much that it poses real problems for energy developers and often for surface landowners because the mineral rights are deemed to be dominant. And so before we go too far down this road, perhaps some additional thought or at least discussion should be given as to whether or not we want pore space to be a severable right, or whether it ought to be an integral right that cannot be separated from the surface. And I think the surface, that would be an issue that's worthy of some additional discussion.
That's a great point, and it's also true that not all states have that, that surface owners even have any of the rights ever, whether it's severable or not. So that's something that we're dealing with in some of the other states and thinking about who's going to own that pore space underneath. So it is unique to Wyoming at this point. It's a really good point, whether it's severable or integrated to their ownership. I'd like to open up the floor to some questions if anybody has any. We have a really diverse expertise up here. It's been an incredible panel. Thank you much.
So one of the questions that come up in our mind when talking about landowners thinking about getting involved with, I'd say, soil carbon storage, is there's a little bit of snake oil fatigue that happens, where there's a lot of people that are saying, hey, we can make you a lot of money to do this, just sign this here. And there's a lot of big concern that I think comes from that. And then the other part I think that's difficult for a lot of landowners to think about is what am I, because these are long-term contracts often, what am I basically requiring my kids, my grandkids to do, and what obligations am I putting on those guys now? Because I signed this for something that might be a very nascent market at this point, because when it comes to the carbon soil, it seems like the nascent market. How can we help with that? That would be my question, because when I've given advice to my clients, I'm often very concerned about, don't make sure you're put on the line if you're not storing as much carbon as we thought you were going to store. How can we protect a landowner from that and overcome those issues?
Okay, typical academic answer here, but research. So I'm with you in that I think a lot of the soil amendments that are being sold might not live up to the hype. And I think we need, independent academic-based research that is not influenced by corporations trying to make money, trying, to figure out if these are actually useful products. So I'm actually interested in that myself. And I'm talking with the Abandoned Mines Division right now because I found out they're using some mycorrhizal products. And yeah, I just want to see if they're working and if they're getting their money's worth. So I'm with you that we just need more research done by independent researchers to look if they're actually useful or not.
It's a great point, and to follow up on that, that might speak to kind of the ideal structures when it comes to incentivizing, especially surface soil carbon removal, in that we know how to measure it well, but it can be expensive and not really scalable. So in some senses, a program like EQIP or the CRP program that the USDA is already using to incentivize landowners for a practice as opposed to the exact amount of carbon will get the job done in terms of removing some carbon without the onus on the landowner to prove exactly how much. Another question?
Yeah, carbon dioxide is bad enough. Methane's even worse for our atmosphere. And I'd like to hear you address the fact that cows emit methane at a very high rate. I think it's comparable to what airplanes put in the atmosphere, or even higher. So what can farmers do, or what are they willing to do? What kind of incentives? I know there are some things like red seaweed has been shown to reduce methane, but what are you aware of that farmers are willing to do and are doing now in Wyoming?
As far as Wyoming is concerned, again, because most of the livestock, we do have a few feedlots in the state, not large, very large ones. Most of the livestock are out on open range, so practices such as the seaweed one, which has been proven to be effective in some ways, it doesn't work out there. It can work in some different climates, but there are so many factors here. The type of forage that the animal is eating influences significantly the amount of methane that is released. So that's an initial analysis that needs to be done if you're talking about this. Also important to keep in mind that while methane is a very powerful, it dissipates in the atmosphere at a much faster rate than carbon does. So typically what I've heard based on the science would be 10 years and the methane is largely gone. I do see, and I read more every day about practices they're coming up with and feeding in these large, intense feedlots like you would see east of here in Nebraska or down into Colorado, that they are identifying some practices they can implement there that will have the ability to significantly reduce those concentrated methane exposures.
And I can't speak to Wyoming, but as a scientist from California, we have a lot of dairy practices, a lot of dairy farms in California, and one of our big emitters is nitrous oxide and methane from those operations, especially around manure management. And that's not nearly as much of an issue here in Wyoming because of how much space you all have. But that's a piece of, especially about the manure management, that we're working on harnessing and reducing emissions from too, because you're right, methane and especially nitrous oxide are two really major greenhouse gases that if we can abate that from the agricultural sector, that can do a lot for us.
Hello. I also have a question for you all. So several of you brought up educating landowners, and I'm curious your thoughts on what do you envision educating landowners looking like? Who would you like to actually go and speak to them? And what do you want them to say?
I guess I'll take a first stab at this. It's a gradual process. I think that's one to keep in mind. As an example, with our organization, which represents the cattle industry in the state, we have 2 conventions a year, and we get several hundred people at each of those. We'll be having one next month, and we do have some speakers coming in going to talk about this very issue and what the opportunities are potentially for landowners with carbon sequestration. So it's a gradual process. Among the agricultural community across the board, there are those who are quick to embrace something like this, or at least to explore it, and there clearly are those who, unless driven by desperation, are not about to become interested in this because they don't believe in frankly, the science that drives it. And so it's a gradual process, and I think it's based on other issues I've dealt with within our own industry. Once this has started, which has only really been in the last few years that it's taken on some prominence and discussion here in Wyoming, we're probably 2 decades away from the point when the vast majority of landowners in the state embrace opportunities to do some of these practices for carbon sequestration. I think one of the keys is that as far as the surface sequestration, these programs can be marketed not because they're going to sequester carbon, but because they're going to enhance the rangelands. It's better management, it means more pounds of gain on your calves, and that's really the selling point. And the carbon sequestration, from the landowner's perspective, may be nothing more than a secondary benefit that can, under circumstances, provide an additional cash flow.
I would add to that we rely on the University of Wyoming a lot. They have some great resources that talk specifically about this practice and its safety and what it's actually doing. Great visual aids that we utilize a bunch. One of the things that we have to pay attention to when we do something on state lands is that we're kind of seen as if the state does it, then it must be okay, which I love that responsibility. But at the same time, you have to meet that responsibility. So we have done a lot of research with DEQ, with the University of Wyoming, when we entered into those deep sequestration leases, but then also say, this is where we found our information. This is why we felt comfortable moving forward with those types of activities and why we think our lessees would benefit. And maybe by a little bit of a separate function, we're obligating our neighbors to that type of practice too, but we did it with that information in the background, and we readily provide that. But I think the University of Wyoming has done a great job and is a very valuable resource for that education.
Yeah, I'm going to plug Extension again. We have offices all over the state, and it's amazing. We also have some really unique degree opportunities at the University of Wyoming. So the School of Energy Resources has a land management degree, and then we also have a rangeland degree. So we're educating the next generation of landowners and managers here. And, it's really hard to ignore your kid when they come home from college and they're like, Dad, have you considered moving the cattle around a little more? So we are, pushing that change through educating the next generation and making these resources available.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank the panelists. Oh, we have time for one more question, and then we're going to take a short break. But one more question first.
Yes, sorry. Don't mean to cut the break, but I just had a question for you all, because a lot of the conversation in here and kind of in general is, what can landowners do better to sequester more carbon? But I think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of ranchers in Wyoming are already managing land well. That's resulting in soil carbon storage. So my question is, how can we better educate the public who thinks cows are destroying the planet when in the state of Wyoming, we're storing a lot of carbon on these ranches? So how can we better educate consumers and show that well-managed grazing results in soil carbon storage?
I think you raise an extremely important point, and one of my favorite statements when I stand with a group of ranchers is to point out the fact that historically, as ranchers in Wyoming, in the West, wherever, we've taken care of our livestock, we've been good stewards of our land, and we felt that we're doing it right, and what we do is nobody else's business. We're in an era today with all of the technology and communication that's out there that what we do every day on our farm or our ranch is everybody's business, and we've been slow, frankly, in stepping up to the challenge of telling that story, and carbon is one of many, many examples of where that has failed. I do think that we're beginning to see progress with that. More and more things are coming out through social media, particularly, that people are finding things that tell that story. Here in Wyoming, for example, we have our beef council that primarily promotes the product, but they promote how that product is raised as well. And California is an example of a state that's gone even further. They've created an entity that is industry funded to tell the story about things like this. And we're looking at that as a potential in Wyoming as well. How do we tell our story to the not just within our own state, where I think it's a little better understood, but we've got to tell our story to the whole nation, and frankly, because we export product as well, we need to tell it to the world.
And I would add to what Jim said, and something that he should have said, which is he promotes the Environmental Stewardship Tour, which is a celebration of a ranch that does great conservation measures for a bunch of different reasons, but also for livestock production, how they've enhanced their livestock production if that's what's occurred. But through that program, he invites landowners to come witness that, to come and view what the practices are, and they have a great back and forth conversation, and those practices are taken home to those people who attended the tour and hopefully are employed. But part of that is a very wide recognition of that individual. You bring in congressional leadership to recognize that individual, and hopefully through that it just spreads like wildfire of those great practices that are being done on that specific place that could be done elsewhere. And I think that's one of the great programs in the state of Wyoming, to highlight the great work that some people are doing, and to recognize everybody who pays attention to that. And I think that's the key point. You have to pay attention to that. Who pay attention to that are able to just exponentially spread the word that these are great practices that are occurring and can be duplicated.
And one piece of that might be to kind of highlight your local source of where you're getting your beef, for example, whoever the consumers are, to knowing where is this coming from and what are the practices there. Because in Wyoming, where you have so much space, the balance between methane emissions and the carbon sequestration happening from management is really different from other regions of the country, where that balance is actually much less climate positive. So I would say that maybe to your question, maybe kind of marketing that local balance, greenhouse gas balance, would be to your benefit here in Wyoming. Yeah. And with that, I'd like to thank our speakers, if we can give them a round of applause. And I'd like to welcome you to take a little short break, and all the speakers, if you're on a panel, if you could come up to the front, we're going to take a little photo. Thanks.